The rain over Gotham fell the way it always did on nights that mattered, in slow silver threads that caught the neon of a dying skyline. Batman moved through the flooded rooftops of the old industrial district with the certainty of a man who had walked this path 1,000 times in his mind before setting foot upon it. Beneath him, in the belly of a decommissioned reactor, the Joker laughed into a microphone wired to something that should never have existed. Stolen schematics from Luthor, cannibalized components from Palmer, and a stabilizer core carved out of a fallen piece of Kryptonian technology hummed together in an unholy chorus. Bruce had seen weapons that could end cities. This was something else. This was a wound waiting to be opened. He dropped through the skylight the moment the countdown began. Glass rained around him like frozen stars, and for a single suspended heartbeat he saw the Joker turn, painted mouth stretched into that familiar grin, eyes bright with the particular joy of a man who had finally invented a punchline large enough to swallow the world. The device ignited. There was no sound, only a pressure that folded inward, a silence so complete it felt like drowning. Batman felt his cape tear, felt the floor beneath him become suggestion rather than substance, felt every bone in his body remember every fracture it had ever known. He reached for the detonator on his belt out of reflex, though there was nothing left to detonate. The last thing he heard was laughter, distant now, thinning into a sound like wind through empty cathedrals. Then the world simply stopped being. When awareness returned, it came slowly, the way tide returns to a battered shore. He was on his back, staring upward, and the sky above him was wrong. The constellations were unfamiliar, arranged in patterns his memory refused to identify. Chicago light pollution should have washed them out entirely, yet here they burned clean and sharp as if the atmosphere itself had been polished. He sat up, cataloging pain, cataloging damage, cataloging everything. His suit was intact. His utility belt was intact. His mind, thankfully, was still his own. The city around him resembled Gotham the way a cousin resembles a brother. The bones were familiar, but every joint had been rearranged by an unfamiliar hand. Signage read in English but referenced companies he had never heard of. A billboard advertised something called Rexplode Cola. Another displayed a smiling family beneath the words "Safer Skies, thanks to our guardians." Batman moved into the shadows before the first pedestrian could notice him. For 3 days he did not sleep. He watched, he listened, he collected. Newsstands sold papers with headlines that spoke of orbital battles, of superhumans who overturned aircraft carriers with the ease of a child upending toys. Broadcasts introduced a team called the Guardians of the Globe with the casual familiarity of local weathermen. Above them all towered one name, spoken with reverence bordering on worship: Omni-Man, Earth's greatest protector, a husband, a father, a god who paid his taxes. Batman felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He infiltrated a municipal records office on the 4th night. The systems were unfamiliar, but the human failings that ran them were not. Passwords written on adhesive notes, backup drives left unencrypted. Within an hour, he had accessed years of security footage, incident reports, and internal correspondence. Within 2, he had found the first inconsistency. Within 3, the second. By dawn, he had counted 17. Someone was editing this world's history. Someone with clearance no ordinary official should possess. Somewhere beneath a mountain in Nevada, a man named Cecil Stedman stared at a monitor flashing red. An unregistered dimensional signature had appeared on the eastern seaboard, and everything Cecil knew about probability told him it should not be there. Higher still, above the clouds where the air thinned to nothing, another figure hovered in perfect stillness. His crimson cape did not move. His pale eyes narrowed. He had felt the newcomer arrive, and now he was descending. Batman had built a life on the mathematics of fear. Fear was leverage. Fear was the space between a criminal's certainty and his surrender. In Gotham, fear could be shaped, sharpened, deployed like a scalpel against men who believed themselves untouchable. But standing on a rooftop in this new city, watching a figure descend from the clouds without wings or engine or apparent effort, Bruce understood that every principle he had ever refined would require re-examination. The man landed on the gravel with the gentleness of a falling leaf. His boots made no sound. His mustache was immaculate. He wore a smile that seemed carefully rehearsed in a mirror at some point in the distant past. A smile that had been used so often it had lost the ability to reach the eyes above it. "You're new here," Omni-Man said. His voice was warm, avuncular. The voice of a man reading a bedtime story. "I don't recognize you, and I recognize everyone." Batman did not answer immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, watching the small tells that most beings would miss. The half-second delay between blink and breath, the way the shoulders held themselves too still. The absence of the microscopic muscle tremors that ordinary conversation produced in ordinary throats. This was a man who had spent decades learning to appear human, and had learned almost, but not quite, well enough. "I'm passing through," Batman said. "Through where? Wherever this is." Omni-Man laughed. It was a good laugh. It had the correct rhythm. It had the correct volume. It had almost nothing else. "You're on Earth, friend, and judging by that suit, you're a long way from home. Farther than you know." They spoke for perhaps 11 minutes. Batman answered nothing directly and asked less. Omni-Man circled the conversation the way a wolf circles a den, sniffing for weakness, offering courtesy as camouflage. When he finally rose back into the sky with a pleasant farewell, Batman remained motionless for a long time, letting the encounter replay behind his eyes. Every word had been a probe. Every kindness had been a knife testing the seam of an armor Nolan Grayson had not yet identified. By the second week, Cecil Stedman decided to stop pretending he did not know where the stranger was. Surveillance had captured Batman disarming 3 armed robberies without discharging a weapon, defusing a hostage situation with nothing but a lowered voice, and vanishing from a rooftop moments before satellite lock could confirm his position. Cecil had watched the footage twice, then a third time, and had rubbed his forehead in the particular way he reserved for problems that refused to fit into categories. The invitation to the Global Defense Agency arrived, not as a summons, but as a folded note left on the windshield of a stolen car Batman had briefly borrowed. It contained an address, a time, and 3 words. "We should talk." He accepted, because information was oxygen and this world had made him poor. The facility beneath the desert was a cathedral of practical paranoia. Cecil offered coffee. Batman declined. Cecil offered cooperation. Batman accepted, adjusting nothing in his voice to indicate that acceptance was tactical rather than sincere. Cecil, who had spent a lifetime reading men, understood exactly what was happening and respected it enough not to insult either of them by mentioning it. "You'll meet the team," Cecil said. "Some of them are good. Some of them are complicated. All of them are useful." They arrived in stages. Robot, whose politeness felt like a translation from a language of pure calculation. Rex Splode, whose bravado wore thin the moment it met a gaze that did not blink. Adam Eve, whose creative gifts were matched by a wariness that spoke of losses Batman recognized without needing them explained. Donald Ferguson, who moved with the quiet competence of a man carrying secrets larger than his rank, and then Mark Grayson. He was young. Not merely in years, but in the particular way that only those who had never truly been broken could be. He greeted Batman with an open handshake and a grin that had inherited none of his father's careful choreography. Bruce felt something twist behind his sternum that he had not felt since a boy named Dick Grayson had stood in the manor foyer clutching a small suitcase. He did not name the feeling. He never named it. But he cataloged it the way he cataloged everything and set it aside for later study. Their first mission together was small. A weapons cache in an abandoned foundry. Mark wanted to punch through the wall. Batman raised a single-gloved hand, and without a word indicated the ventilation shaft, the guard rotation, the tripwire near the eastern door. Mark stared at all 3 details he had failed to notice, then looked back at the man beside him with an expression that would eventually reshape his understanding of what strength meant. "You didn't move," Mark said afterward on the flight back. "The whole time. You just stood there and things happened around you." "Movement is expensive," Batman said. "Stillness costs nothing." Mark thought about that for the rest of the night. Batman thought about the murdered Guardians for the rest of the week. He had accessed the crime scene records 3 days after arriving at the GDA. He had watched the footage twice, because watching it once was insufficient to be certain of what he was seeing. The angle of the impact wounds, the timing of the injuries. The specific selection of who was killed first and who was allowed to die last. It was not a massacre. Massacres were chaotic. This was choreography. This was a man dismantling colleagues in the order that best served his own escape from suspicion. Only one being on this earth possessed the strength required, and only one being had been conveniently absent, then conveniently arrived, then conveniently wept. Batman burned the copies he made. He encrypted the originals behind 7 layers of security no one on this world would know how to breach. He did not tell Cecil. He did not tell Mark. He did not tell anyone, because he understood what the truth would cost. Mark would break. Debbie would collapse. The GDA would panic and provoke a confrontation neither Earth nor its heroes were prepared to survive. The evidence was not a weapon yet. It was a wound. And Batman had learned long ago that wounds must be opened only when a healer stood ready with thread. He stared at the ceiling of his borrowed quarters and let the silence settle over him like an old familiar coat. Somewhere above the clouds, a father tucked his son into memory and wondered when the stranger would make a mistake. Preparation had always been Batman's religion. In Gotham, he had built contingencies for every metahuman who had ever crossed the city's borders, catalogued weaknesses of allies and enemies alike inside a mind that refused to trust probability. On this earth, deprived of his cave, his suppliers, his decades of accumulated resources, he was reduced to first principles. And first principles, he reminded himself, had always been enough. He began with blood. A single vial drawn under false pretenses during a routine GDA medical checkup Mark had good-naturedly submitted to after a training exercise. Bruce apologized silently to the boy each time he examined the sample beneath borrowed equipment in a basement laboratory 2 states away. Viltrumite cells did not merely resist damage. They recorded it, adapted to it, evolved responses that made repeated exposure to identical attacks less effective over time. This was not durability. This was biological doctrine. He studied satellite trajectories next, mapping every flight path Omni-Man had taken over the past decade. Patterns emerged that no human pilot would ever produce. Efficiency without hesitation. Routes that indicated a mind entirely unafraid of interception. A man who traveled the sky the way a landowner walked his own property. Sonic frequencies came third, regenerative limits fourth, sleep cycles fifth. By the 20th day, Batman had assembled a document that ran to 63 pages, single-spaced, containing not a single weapon but every observable parameter of a being who considered himself unopposable. He did not intend to defeat Omni-Man physically. That path led only to atomized ashes. He intended instead to understand him, to find the shape of the man beneath the god. Because every god, in Bruce's long experience, was ultimately a man who had forgotten how to be afraid. And every man who had forgotten fear had also forgotten the reasons he had once required it. The Viltrumite scouts arrived on a Tuesday. He intercepted the first transmission through a cobbled-together array he had built inside an abandoned observatory in Colorado. The language was not human. The rhythm was. Command, response, confirmation, military brevity. He fed the audio through translation algorithms he had reverse-engineered from robots' public research papers. And by dawn he had enough to understand the essential message. Earth had been judged. Earth had been catalogued. Earth had been assigned. Nolan Grayson's mission was nearly complete, and the empire he served was preparing to collect its inheritance. Batman brought the intelligence to Cecil that same morning. Cecil listened, drank his coffee, listened more, and finally set the cup down with the careful precision of a man deciding how much of an inconvenient truth he could afford to accept. "You've been on my planet for 6 weeks, Cecil said. 7. And you're telling me the guy who has saved this world 9 times is planning to sell it. I'm telling you what the transmissions say. Transmissions you decoded alone in a barn. Observatory." Cecil sighed. He did not disbelieve. He also did not quite believe. He agreed to increase monitoring, to quietly reallocate certain assets, to keep Batman informed of anything that might corroborate. It was less than Bruce had hoped for and more than he had expected. Cecil Stedman was, above all else, a man who had learned to survive by refusing to move faster than necessity demanded. Batman accepted the compromise and returned to the field. In the weeks that followed, he accompanied Mark on 7 missions. a hostage situation aboard a hijacked freighter, a collapsed apartment building in Detroit, a rogue biotech laboratory outside Portland. Each time, Batman positioned himself where the boy could see the work rather than merely the result. Where Mark would have flown through a wall, Batman studied the wall until it revealed a door. Where Mark would have absorbed a bullet meant for a hostage, Batman rerouted the shooter's line of sight until the bullet was never fired. Where Mark would have shouted, Batman whispered, and the room quieted around him. "You don't win," Mark said one night on a rooftop in Baltimore, catching his breath he did not need. "You just make winning unnecessary. Winning is what happens when you fail to prevent a fight." Mark considered this the way a young man considers a language he suddenly realizes he has been mispronouncing all his life. He said nothing. He nodded once. He flew home slower than usual. Nolan noticed. Bruce felt the shift the next time father and son were in the same room. Omni-Man's smile remained, but its edges had grown a fraction sharper. He spoke to Mark with the same affection as always, and Mark responded with the same warmth, and yet there was a new distance between them. A distance measured not in feet but in questions Mark had begun to ask himself, and had not yet dared to voice aloud. Nolan understood the geometry of that distance the way a man understands the first crack in a beloved and irreplaceable object. The confrontation with the Viltrumite scout came on a moonless night in the Nevada high desert. Batman had chosen the location 3 weeks in advance. He had seeded the ground with sensors, mapped the thermal profile of every rock formation within a 2-mile radius, and stockpiled tools that would have looked to any Viltrumite eye like the useless toys of an inferior species. The scout landed with the confidence of a hunter arriving at feeding grounds. He was tall, ash-pale, and utterly certain that this encounter would end with a corpse he was not obligated to bury. Batman never engaged him directly. He led him through a canyon where the acoustics tripled the volume of the scout's own war cry until it disoriented his balance. Across a dry lake bed where compressed magnesium flares Bruce had planted 2 nights before erupted at optical wavelengths calibrated to Viltrumite retinas. Into a slot canyon where the walls narrowed just enough that the alien's superior strength became a liability rather than an advantage, his limbs unable to fully extend, his flight unable to fully engage. By the time the scout realized he was being hunted rather than fleeing, Batman was already gone. The alien departed without a body to carry home, but he departed with something worse. A report, a description. A conviction, spoken later to a superior officer light years away, that Earth contained a creature who had defeated a Viltrumite scout without possessing a single ability worth cataloging. Somewhere in the outer arm of a distant galaxy, an admiral marked a name he did not yet know onto a list of threats. Earth had officially become interesting. And in the quiet of his borrowed room, Batman washed blood from his gauntlet and reminded himself, as he had every night for 30 years, that being interesting to gods was the beginning of every disaster worth surviving. The GDA archives were not so much a library as a mausoleum. Deep beneath the main facility, in vaults that required biometric confirmations Batman had quietly rendered obsolete within his first month on Earth, lay decades of intelligence collected from every dimensional incursion humanity had ever survived. Cecil Stedman had built the collection the way a miser builds a hoard, adding to it constantly, sharing it almost never, trusting no eye but his own to interpret its contents. Batman spent 4 consecutive nights in those vaults. He emerged from the 4th with a headache that would not lift for 3 days. The Viltrumites were not what he had assumed. He had prepared for conquerors of the ordinary variety, warlords whose expansion was driven by hunger, or ideology, or the tedious economics of empire. What he found instead was a civilization that had, at some ancient point in its history, made a single collective decision from which it had never recovered. They had chosen survival above all things. The records, translated from fragments recovered across 100 worlds, spoke of a homeworld once torn apart by internal wars so devastating that only the strongest bloodlines had endured. From that inheritance had grown a philosophy that no longer permitted weakness of any kind. Compassion, in Viltrumite thought, was a genetic disease. Mercy was a suicide impulse dressed in noble clothing. To spare an enemy was to leave a seed that would one day grow into a blade at your children's throats. Batman read these accounts by the light of a single desk lamp and felt something he had not expected to feel, not sympathy. Sympathy would have been an insult to the millions of dead that this doctrine had produced. What he felt instead was recognition. He had spent his life fighting men who had convinced themselves that cruelty was necessity. He understood, at a level deeper than intellect, what it meant to inherit a wound so old that you no longer questioned whether the bandage was still needed. Nolan Grayson had been raised inside that inheritance. Nolan Grayson had loved a human woman, had fathered a human child, had walked among fragile beings for 2 decades, and had learned to laugh at their jokes. Whatever monster stood in the sky above this earth, he was not merely a monster. He was a man who had spent every waking moment fighting to remember that he was one. Batman closed the archives and did not sleep that night. Debbie Grayson called him 3 days later. She did not say why. She asked to meet at a small restaurant near her home, one Bruce recognized from surveillance photographs as the place she went when she needed to be surrounded by strangers rather than friends. He arrived out of costume in a plain, dark coat and unremarkable clothes because she had asked him to, and because he understood that some conversations required the man rather than the symbol. She was already seated when he arrived. She had ordered nothing. Her hands were folded on the table in the particular way of a woman who had rehearsed this meeting 100 times and still did not know how to begin. "Something is wrong with my husband," she said. Bruce nodded once. "You already know," she said. He nodded again. She did not cry. He respected her enormously for that. She asked him what he knew, and he told her only what she was ready to hear, which was not everything but was enough. She asked him what she should do. He told her the truth, which was that he did not know, and that anyone who claimed otherwise would be lying to her. She thanked him for that. She said no one had told her the truth in a very long time. Before she left, she reached across the table and gripped his hand with a strength he had not expected. Her eyes were dry and terrible and utterly focused. "Protect my son," she said. "Whatever happens, whatever you have to do, I will." She left. He sat for a long time afterward, watching the door swing closed behind her, and thought about promises, and about the men who broke them, and about the men who did not. His conversations that week formed a slow constellation. He spoke with Cecil about the arithmetic of casualties, about the impossible mathematics of a leader who must occasionally choose which of his own citizens to sacrifice. Cecil, who had made those choices for 30 years, offered no comfort and no defense. He simply confirmed that the weight never left, and that any leader who claimed it had was either lying or already lost. He spoke with Robot about the definition of humanity. The android, whose own existence Bruce had come to suspect was more complicated than public record admitted, argued that humanity was not a species but a choice, renewed daily, sometimes hourly, by anyone capable of making it. Bruce found the argument more persuasive than he wished to admit. He spoke with Mark on a rooftop overlooking the Chicago River. They did not discuss Nolan because Mark was not ready. They discussed instead the simpler question of what heroes owed to the people they saved. Mark believed heroes owed everything. Bruce told him that was correct, and also that the debt could never be paid, and that a hero who understood this would live longer than one who did not. Alone, at night, Bruce confronted a ledger he rarely opened. Jason. Always Jason first. The question of whether faster reflexes or an earlier warning could have kept a boy alive. The question of whether the Joker's continued breath was itself a moral failure that Bruce had chosen, night after night, out of a fear of becoming the thing he hunted. Gotham had never known peace. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps a single ruthless act, decades ago, would have spared thousands of subsequent horrors. He did not have answers. He never had answers. He had only the same discipline that had carried him through every long night. The discipline of continuing to ask the question honestly, refusing the false comfort of certainty in either direction. His doubts, he realized, ran parallel to Nolan Grayson's buried humanity. Both of them were men who had inherited terrible frameworks. Both of them were men who had made compromises whose full cost they had not yet been asked to pay. The difference was that Bruce had never stopped counting. The transmissions arrived on the last night of the month. Batman intercepted them in the same observatory using the same equipment, and this time the message required no translation. He understood the shape of it before the words resolved. Viltrum was not sending a scout. Viltrum was not sending a squad. Viltrum was sending an army. He listened to the entire transmission twice. Then he began to write. The truth broke in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. There was no dramatic reveal, no thunderclap of destiny, no orchestral swell to warn the world of what was coming. There was only a father and a son standing on a lawn in suburban Illinois, and a conversation that began with a question and ended with the sky itself catching fire. Batman was in Chicago when the first tremor arrived. He felt it through the soles of his boots before any alarm sounded, a subtle wrongness in the deep architecture of the world, and he understood immediately what had happened. Some part of him had been waiting for this moment since the night he arrived, and now that it had come, he felt only the cold clarity of a man watching a predicted storm finally cross the horizon. He was in the GDA command center within 7 minutes. Cecil was already there, jaw tight, eyes fixed on a wall of monitors that showed impossibilities in real time. Omni-Man and Invincible were fighting, not sparring, not training, fighting the way tectonic plates fight when they finally choose to move. Every impact registered on seismographs designed to measure earthquakes. Every collision left a crater the size of a city block. "Get me eyes on population centers along their trajectory," Batman said. "All of them, now." Cecil did not argue. He gave the order. The rest of the day dissolved into a single unbroken action. Batman evacuated a subway station in Cleveland by hijacking the public address system and speaking with a calm that made panicking impossible. He redirected air traffic over Detroit by walking into an FAA control tower and telling 3 exhausted operators exactly which flights to reroute and in what order. He guided a hospital's neonatal ward into its basement shelter by phone while simultaneously coordinating 3 separate rescue teams through an earpiece Cecil had given him without explanation. He did not save everyone. He would remember, for the rest of his life, the names he did not reach in time. He would remember the elementary school in Peoria whose gymnasium collapsed 40 seconds before the evacuation order reached it. He would remember the elderly couple in a nursing home outside Indianapolis whose wing was leveled by a piece of falling debris no one had predicted would land there. He would remember them all, because remembering was the price of the work, and Batman had always paid that price in full. Mark lost. Everyone who saw the footage understood immediately that this was not a defeat that could be measured in physical damage alone. The boy had entered the fight believing his father was the strongest man on Earth. He left it broken in ways that had nothing to do with bones. Batman found him in a Wyoming field 2 hours after Nolan finally, inexplicably left. Mark was on his knees. He was not crying. He was past crying. He was in the particular stillness of a young person who has just discovered that the world he had trusted did not exist, had never existed, had been a story told to him by a man he had loved without reservation. Bruce did not offer words. Words at that moment would have been an insult. He knelt beside the boy in the ruined grass and stayed there, silent, until Mark finally, hours later, stood. He said he was sorry, Mark said. His voice was hollow. At the end, he said he was sorry. "I know." Did he mean it? Batman thought carefully before he answered. He meant it enough to leave. Mark absorbed this. Then he asked the question Bruce had been dreading. "You knew, didn't you?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have died." Mark looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and the nod was the beginning of something Bruce recognized from his own history. The small, hard motion of a young person taking the first step toward becoming the adult they had not asked to become. The days that followed were their own kind of aftermath. Cecil's weapons had failed publicly and expensively, And the Global Defense Agency spent a week in the particular chaos of an organization that had staked its reputation on being prepared for exactly the disaster it had not been prepared for. Contingency plans that had looked sensible on paper dissolved on contact with a reality involving beings capable of shattering hills. Congressional inquiries began before the dust had settled. Careers ended. Institutions cracked. Robot approached Batman on the 7th day. The android's voice, always precise, carried a new note that Bruce could not quite name. "I have been recalculating," Robot said. "The models I used to project humanity's long-term survival assumed that our upper ceiling of threat was defined by known variables. That assumption has been invalidated. I no longer believe humanity is likely to survive the coming century." "You may be right," Batman said. "You are not comforting me. I am not in the business of comfort." "What are you in the business of?" Batman considered. "Making sure your projections stay wrong." Robot said nothing for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, a small gesture that from him carried the weight of a treaty. The impossible choices came on the 9th day. 2 coordinated attacks by looters and opportunistic warlords broke out simultaneously on opposite sides of the continent, exploiting the crippled response capacity of a country still reeling. Batman had assets sufficient to intervene in one. He had to choose. He chose the smaller crisis because the larger one had a functional local response already mobilizing, and the smaller had none. 400 people lived because of the choice. An unknown number died in the larger event because he could not divide himself. The mathematics were the mathematics. He accepted them and did not sleep that night or the next or the one after. When the immediate crisis finally subsided, the city held a memorial. The mayor spoke. Survivors wept. Church bells rang. The world, in its exhausted way, began the process of pretending that survival was the same as recovery. Batman did not attend the memorial. He walked instead through the ruined blocks after dark, alone, with a small notebook in which he wrote every name he had been given by the coroner's office. He wrote them slowly. He wrote them all. When the notebook was full, he began a second one. He did not intend to publish the list. He did not intend to show it to anyone. He simply intended to remember, because remembering was the only form of accountability available to a man who had been unable to save them. Somewhere unimaginably far away, Nolan Grayson stood in a debriefing chamber and reported that Earth had proven strategically valuable. The order for full conquest was issued before he finished speaking. The years between the day hope broke and the day the Empire arrived were the strangest of Bruce Wayne's long, strange life. He had never in Gotham enjoyed the luxury of preparing for a single named enemy on a fixed timetable. His war had always been an improvisation against 1,000 small evils that renewed themselves each night. Here, on this Earth, he was granted something he had never possessed: a deadline, a specific enemy, a clear and monstrous goal against which every hour of preparation could be measured. He did not waste a minute of it. The plan he built was not a weapon. It was a philosophy rendered into logistics. He had understood from the first week of his exile that no single device would ever defeat a Viltrumite invasion. Even Cecil's most powerful assets had proved insufficient against a single deviant. An entire fleet required a different arithmetic. It required, Bruce had concluded, the transformation of an entire world into an environment specifically hostile to a specific enemy. He worked with Robot on orbital traps that would seed low Earth orbit with magnetized debris fields calibrated to Viltrumite flight signatures. He worked with Adam Eve on resonance weapons that used her matter-shaping abilities to generate frequencies calculated to disrupt Viltrumite inner ear equivalents at close range. He worked with Cecil on atmospheric kill zones, invisible corridors seeded with airborne particulates that would ignite on contact with the friction signatures of hypersonic flight. He worked with military planners across 4 continents on evacuation protocols that treated every civilian life as a sacred variable rather than a rounding error. Above all, he worked with Mark. The boy had become a young man in the years since Nolan left. He was still capable of joy, still capable of the reckless optimism that had first drawn Bruce to him. But there was a new stillness underneath it now, a settled weight that had not been there before. He asked questions in a different tone. He listened before he acted. He had begun, without ever admitting it aloud, to think. "You've changed," Batman told him one night on a training ground carved into the side of a Colorado mountain. "I had to. Not everyone does." Mark looked at him for a long time. "You never told me who you were," he said. "Before all this, where you came from. What kind of world made you? You wouldn't recognize it. Try me." Bruce did in his way. He told Mark about a city that never slept because it never dared to. He told him about a boy who had watched his parents die outside a theater and had spent the rest of his life turning that grief into a discipline. He told him about a family of orphans he had gathered around a war he could not fight alone. He did not name Jason. He did not need to. Mark understood what silences meant now. "So this is why you're helping us," Mark said. "Numero. I'm helping you because you needed it. I stayed because you deserved it." Mark did not answer. He nodded, the small hard nod that had become his signature, and returned to training. The Viltrumite fleet arrived on a Wednesday. They came at the pace of gods who had never met resistance worth accelerating for. 12 of them spread across a formation designed to encircle rather than penetrate, moving through the upper atmosphere with the patient certainty of surgeons preparing to open a body they had already decided was theirs. Every Viltrumite in the formation had killed civilizations before. Every one of them expected this to be another routine harvest. They found instead the culmination of 6 years of quiet preparation. The orbital debris fields activated first, catching the outer 3 flyers in a lattice of magnetized shrapnel that did not damage them precisely, but did disrupt their flight vectors sufficiently to force them into predetermined atmospheric corridors. The atmospheric kill zones activated second, igniting around the disrupted flyers in coordinated bursts that scorched their armor without piercing it, but that also, critically, disoriented their sense of altitude for the 12 seconds required for Adam Eve's resonance emitters to lock. The emitters activated third, and for the first time in the recorded history of the Viltrumite species, an entire flight formation experienced something none of them had ever previously known: confusion. The battle that followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a coordinated global choreography. Every hero on Earth had been assigned a specific role, calibrated to their specific abilities. No one attempted to defeat a Viltrumite alone. No one attempted to hold ground that did not need to be held. Populations moved along evacuation corridors that had been rehearsed monthly for years. Military assets deployed in patterns that had been optimized against every possible Viltrumite counter-strategy Batman could imagine. The Viltrumites, whose entire doctrine was built on the assumption that they would face isolated resistance, discovered that they were fighting a planet. Mark, in the center of it all, moved with a discipline that would have astonished the boy he had once been. He did not try to win. He tried, instead, to keep his teammates alive, to redirect enemies away from population centers, to buy time for the traps to spring and the evacuations to complete. When he engaged a Viltrumite directly, he did so only to prevent that Viltrumite from reaching a target he had been assigned to protect. He fought the way Batman had taught him. He fought the way a hero fights. Batman himself fought only once, and only because there was no other option. Nolan Grayson arrived in the final hour of the battle, and he did not arrive as an enemy. He arrived confused, uncertain, a man who had been summoned by his empire, and who had come out of habit rather than conviction. He hovered above the ruins of a city he had once claimed to protect, and Batman rose to meet him not on wings but on a modified GDA vertical thruster that lifted him precisely to Nolan's altitude and no higher. "You have to choose," Batman said. "I did choose. Years ago, you chose to leave. You did not choose what came after." Nolan looked at the world beneath him. He looked at the small figure of his son fighting to protect civilians his father had once claimed to love. He looked at the Viltrumite formation being systematically dismantled by an alliance of humans and heroes his own people would have dismissed as insects. "They cannot win," Nolan said. "They already have. You just haven't accepted it. If I turn now, my empire will kill me. Then let them try." Nolan was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than Batman had ever heard it. "My son is watching." Nolan turned toward the sky. He rose. He struck the nearest Viltrumite commander with a force that shattered the formation entirely. The resulting battle reshaped continents. Coastlines redrew themselves. Mountain ranges lost peaks. When it ended, 3 Viltrumites lay dying, 6 lay defeated, and the remaining 3 fled into the void carrying a report their empire would spend a century arguing about. Earth had won. The cost became visible only afterward. The dimensional stabilizer robot had been built as an emergency contingency, designed to seal the residual tears left by Batman's original arrival and by the Viltrumite fleet's entry. Required an active human component to complete its final calibration. The active component would remain trapped inside the stabilization field. The active component would never leave. Bruce understood the moment Robot explained it. So did Mark. So did Cecil. "I'll do it," Mark said immediately. "No, Bruce, please. Your world needs you here. Mine no longer needs me at all." "That isn't true." "It is true enough." Mark did not argue further. He understood, with the terrible clarity of a young man who had been taught to see, that no one else in the room could take Bruce's place, and that Bruce would not permit anyone to try. Batman entered the stabilization chamber alone. He gave no farewell speech. He allowed no ceremony. He simply nodded once to Mark, once to Cecil, and once to the sky, and stepped through the threshold. The field closed behind him. The tears in reality sealed. His path home closed with them. The rebuilding began before the last fires had gone out. Cities rose again, slower than they had fallen, but steadier than anyone had dared to hope. Governments that had spent decades arguing over jurisdictions discovered, in the aftermath, that shared trauma had rewritten the map of what cooperation could look like. Aid moved across borders without the usual paperwork. Refugees were welcomed rather than counted. For the first time in living memory, humanity behaved as though it belonged to a single species. Mark grew into the leader Batman had believed he could become. He did not become his father. He did not become Bruce. He became, at last, himself, a young man who had inherited the strength of gods and had chosen to use it in the service of the small, breakable, endlessly precious lives around him. He led the reformed Guardians with a quiet authority that reminded older heroes of neither Omni-Man's certainty nor his cruelty, and every mission he undertook began with a question no previous Earth hero had thought to ask: who needs help, and what will it cost them to accept it? Debbie Grayson found peace slowly. She did not receive it as a gift. She built it day by day out of the ordinary materials of a life that had refused to end when everything she had trusted had ended. She opened a small counseling practice for survivors of the invasion. She was very good at it. She had, after all, survived more than most. Cecil Stedman aged. He would never publicly credit Bruce for the victory. In private, over a bottle of bourbon in his empty office, he would occasionally lift his glass toward a portrait that hung on no wall, and he would say quietly, "Thank you," and mean it more deeply than any speech he had ever given. Robot, who had been changed by the war in ways he did not yet fully understand, dedicated a private archive to the tactical writings Batman had left behind. He shared them with no one for the first year. In the second year, he began quietly circulating them to selected commanders and strategists. Within a decade, the writings would be considered foundational to every military doctrine on the planet, and no one alive would remember exactly where they had originated. Batman refused monuments. There were offers: a statue in the reconstructed capital, a memorial park in Chicago, a minor planet named in his honor by an astronomical society that had learned the shape of his contribution only through leaked GDA testimony. He declined all of them, in some cases through Mark, in some cases through Cecil, in some cases simply by ensuring that the paperwork required to build them mysteriously vanished from the desks of the officials who had proposed them. He disappeared into the work instead. Months after the victory, small anonymous packages began arriving at police departments across the continent. Case files, evidence, sometimes suspects, bound and unconscious, left on precinct steps at 3 a.m. with detailed confessions pinned to their coats. Organized crime, which had begun to reconstitute itself in the chaos of the post-invasion years, collapsed within 18 months. No one could explain it. Editorials speculated. Podcasts flourished. A theory took hold, first on the internet, later in the mainstream, that a silent guardian had begun watching over the cities of the recovering world. He was almost never seen. When he was described inconsistently by witnesses who had glimpsed him for only a moment, a silhouette on a rooftop, a shadow against a window, a shape too still to be human, moving too gracefully to be anything else. Heroes changed in his wake. Younger recruits began training with the discipline of soldiers rather than the enthusiasm of celebrities. Older heroes retired earlier and taught longer. The reformed Guardians instituted a policy that no member would engage a threat without first securing a civilian evacuation plan, a policy that within a generation had spread to every hero organization on the planet. Eventually, Bruce found a place to work from, deep beneath one of the older, decommissioned GDA facilities in the mountains of Wyoming. He cleared a series of collapsed maintenance tunnels and built, over a period of 18 months, something that resembled a home only in the sense that a fortress resembles one. Servers, training floors. A single quiet room with a chair, a lamp, and a small stack of notebooks in which he had, over the years, written every name. He began slowly to teach. He did not recruit. Students found him. They arrived, always alone, always in the middle of the night, always drawn by some private grief they were still learning to name. He taught them not to become stronger, because strength on this earth was a currency he did not possess. He taught them instead to become wiser, to see, to wait, to act only when action was the only remaining option, and to accept the weight of that action fully when it came. The final image of that first quiet decade was small. Mark stood beside him on a ridge overlooking the sunrise. Earth's atmosphere was still healing, and the colors that morning were richer than any sky either of them had seen in years. "Do you ever wish you could go home?" Mark asked. Bruce smiled faintly. "Home isn't a place. It's the people you're willing to protect." The first anomaly appeared over the Nevada desert on a summer evening 10 years after the invasion. A shimmer in the air, no larger than a doorway, gone almost before the observatory instruments recording it could confirm its existence. The technicians who logged it assumed a sensor malfunction and made a note in a report no one would read for 6 months. The second appeared over the North Sea. The third over the ruins of what had once been Chicago's northern suburbs. The fourth over the Australian outback. By the end of the year, Robot had catalogued 19 of them, and he had brought his catalog to Batman with an expression that on his impassive face passed for something very close to fear. "They are not natural," he said. "They follow patterns. They correspond to the sites of significant events during and after your arrival. Reality is remembering the breach." Batman studied the data for a long time. He had known, at some level, that this day would come. He had prepared for many things during his years on this earth, but he had not prepared for the possibility that his own presence had left permanent scars on the fabric of a world that had otherwise begun to heal. Are they dangerous? Currently, no, but their frequency is increasing. If the pattern continues, some of them will begin to stabilize. And stabilized dimensional apertures, as we learned in the invasion, are doorways. Doorways can be closed. They can also be opened. Batman investigated each anomaly personally, when possible. He recovered fragments from several of them, small objects that appeared to have been drawn through from elsewhere and abandoned when the apertures collapsed. A shard of ceramic bearing a symbol that resembled, at certain angles, the corner of a familiar shield. A scrap of fabric that carried the specific chemical signature of a particular Gotham textile factory that had gone out of business in 1987. A single spent bullet casing engraved with markings only one manufacturer in Bruce's original universe had ever used. His universe was not lost. Whatever remained of it was reaching, blindly and imperfectly, across the space between worlds, searching for the piece of itself that had been torn away. He did not tell Mark immediately. When he finally did, the younger man listened in silence, and then asked the question Bruce had been asking himself for weeks. "Are you going to try to go back?" "I don't know. You've been here almost as long as you were there. Longer, now. Then it's home. It became home. That isn't the same thing." Mark considered this the way he considered everything now, with the patient thoughtfulness that had once been so foreign to him. "You know we'll be fine," he said. "You've made sure of it. Whatever comes next, we can handle it. You've given us everything we needed. Heroes should never assume their work is finished. That doesn't mean it has to be your work forever." Bruce did not have an answer. He recognized the wisdom in what Mark was saying, and he recognized also the deeper truth that Mark did not yet quite understand, which was that leaving now would create a vacuum, and vacuums in the geometry of history were always filled by something. He had spent his life learning to distrust what filled vacuum. He continued to investigate the anomalies through the following winter. He mapped their frequencies. He calculated their trajectories. He built, with robots' help, a monitoring array that would give at least 12 hours of warning before any of them stabilized into a fully passable aperture. The night the final anomaly of that year appeared, Bruce was alone on a mesa in the New Mexico desert, standing beside his monitoring equipment, watching the sky. The shimmer opened above him without warning. It was larger than any of the previous anomalies, and it held itself open for nearly 11 full seconds. In those 11 seconds, through the wavering aperture, Bruce saw something he had not seen in more than a decade. A sky, a specific sky. The polluted, orange-washed sky of a city he knew by heart. And against that sky, drawn in the specific pattern of a beam projected against low cloud cover, the shape of a bat. The bat signal was shining over Gotham. Then the aperture closed, and the desert around him fell dark again, and Bruce stood for a very long time without moving. He did not know if what he had seen had been real. It might have been an echo. It might have been a memory. It might have been a genuine glimpse across the void, someone in his old city still calling for him after all these years, unaware or unwilling to accept that he was not coming. It might have been the universe itself, quietly asking him a question. He walked back to his vehicle in silence. He drove home in silence. He did not sleep. The years that followed the final anomaly were, in their own quiet way, the richest of Bruce Wayne's long life. He aged. He had always known he would. And he had always known that the aging would be harder on a body that had spent decades absorbing the punishment intended for creatures 10 times his mass. His knees complained on cold mornings. His shoulders remembered every dislocation. There was a persistent stiffness in his left hand that made writing slower than it had once been, and he had accepted long ago that certain physical thresholds, once crossed, would never be crossed back. None of it slowed him meaningfully. The work simply changed shape around him. Mark led. He had done so for a decade, and he had grown into it in the way that only the truly gifted ever grow into leadership, which was to say, by discovering gradually and often painfully that leadership was not a reward but a burden willingly carried. He no longer needed Bruce beside him in the field. He needed him, instead, at the end of a long day in a chair by a fire, offering the specific silence that only a friend who had seen everything could offer. The new generation of heroes barely remembered a time before Batman. To them, he was less a person than an idea, a discipline, a philosophy that had shaped the training they had received before they had ever met the man himself. They came to his mountain refuge in ones and twos, at first uncertain, later reverent, and always, eventually changed. He asked them nothing about their powers. He asked them everything about their fears. The ones who could answer honestly stayed. The ones who could not leave, and often returned years later, ready to try again. Under his quiet influence, Earth's heroes had become something the previous generation would not have recognized. Less reactive, more coordinated, slower to strike, and therefore paradoxically faster to resolve. Casualties fell each year for a decade running, in a pattern that statisticians could not explain and that Bruce refused to take credit for. The Reformed Guardians instituted an annual day of remembrance for civilians lost during operations, a practice that spread first across the continent and then across the world. No hero on the planet, by the end of the decade, deployed without knowing the names of the people they were fighting to protect. Bruce had never given a public speech. He never would. His influence traveled instead through the small, private, unbroken chain of individual conversations he had held with individual people over the course of 30 years on this earth. The final anomaly appeared on a spring morning that had been, until that moment, ordinary in every respect. It formed above the ridge outside his mountain refuge, and it did not shimmer, and it did not waver. It held itself open with a patience that felt almost personal. The monitoring array robot had built 2 decades before registered its stability with a quiet alarm that Bruce had almost forgotten how to hear. He walked out to meet it. Through the aperture he could see Gotham, not a memory of Gotham, not an echo. The city itself, alive and grinding and beautiful and terrible, at 3 in the afternoon on what looked like an autumn day. Traffic moved along familiar avenues. Steam rose from familiar grates. A newspaper blew across a familiar sidewalk. He could smell it faintly through the opening. The specific mixture of rain, exhaust, and river that no other city on any other Earth had ever quite reproduced. The aperture would remain open, robots' readings suggested, for approximately 37 minutes. Bruce stood before it. He did not weep. He had never been much for weeping. But he stood there for a long time, and he allowed himself, for those minutes, to remember the manor. Alfred gone now for more years than he wanted to count. The children he had raised, who were adults on the other side of that opening, older than he had been when he had first put on the cowl. The city, the work, the particular exhaustion of a Gotham dawn after a long night of small victory. He thought about home. He thought about what home meant. Mark arrived, because of course he did. He landed lightly on the ridge behind Bruce and did not speak for several long minutes. He simply stood, at the respectful distance he had learned to keep during moments that were not his. "You could go," he said eventually. "I could. They would understand. All of us. I know. You've earned it. That isn't the question." Mark waited. Bruce turned to look at him, at the man Mark had become, at the peaceful, healing world behind him, at the horizon over which the sun was beginning to slide toward evening, at the anomaly that hung in the air like a door left open by a friend. "Home is where I can do the most good," he said finally. "It always has been. I just used to think those two things were the same place." Mark nodded. He said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. The aperture began to narrow as the 37th minute approached. Bruce watched it close with the same steadiness with which he had watched every door in his life close. He did not step through. He did not reach for it. He simply stood beside Mark in the mountain wind and allowed the passage to seal itself for the last time. When the sky was empty again, he turned and walked back toward his refuge, and Mark walked beside him, and neither of them spoke, because speech at that moment would have been an insult to what had just been decided. Decades passed. The specific details of Bruce Wayne's later life were preserved only in the private memories of those who had known him, because he had refused, to the very end, to allow any public record to fix him in place. He continued to train. He continued to work. He continued to solve the small, impossible crimes that no one else on the planet had the patience to solve. And he continued to disappear the moment credit was offered. Children heard stories. Parents told them on quiet evenings about a man who had come from nowhere and had stood against gods, alien empires, and impossible odds using only discipline, compassion, and unwavering resolve. The stories grew, as stories do, into legend. Some claimed he had been a wizard. Some claimed he had been an angel. A few, the closest to the truth, claimed he had been merely a man who had refused, in every moment of his life, to look away from what needed to be done. The final image belongs to a peaceful sunrise. Bruce, older than any human being with his kind of career had any right to be, stood on a ridge outside his refuge and watched the sun rise over an Earth that had once nearly ended and had, instead, learned to endure. The sky was clean. The horizon was quiet. Somewhere in the atmosphere above him, faint and unexplained, a signal echoed once and then faded, and he smiled without turning his face toward it. He had made his choice. He had made it long ago. He had made it every day since. The last unanswered question lingered in the wind over the mountain. If one man without powers could forever change the invincible universe, what other worlds might one day need the dark night?